They huddled in the darkness, 47 Japanese women in torn uniforms, listening to American boots approaching their locked barracks. They had been told what would happen. The propaganda had been clear. American soldiers were animals who showed no mercy to women, so they clutched makeshift weapons, broken chair legs, sharpened spoons, jagged pieces of metal scavenged from the ruins, and they prepared for the worst. But when the door opened on that cold October night in 1945, the Americans carried something these women never expected. Not rifles, not chains, blankets, and steaming cups of tea. If this story moves, you make sure you remember it. Because what happened to these 47 women would teach them the hardest lesson of war. That sometimes the people you are supposed to hate are more human than the ones who taught you to hate them. This is the story of how kindness from the enemy destroyed everything they thought they knew about the world. The island of Saipan had fallen silent after months of brutal fighting. Smoke still rose from destroyed bunkers. The sweet, sick smell of death hung in the tropical air like a curse that would not lift. Palm trees stood stripped to splinters, their trunks scarred black from fire and shrapnel. Among the wreckage, American forces discovered something unexpected. A group of Japanese women, military auxiliaries who had been stationed on the island as nurses, radio operators, and administrative staff. There were 47 of them, ranging from barely 19 to their early 30s. Their crisp military uniforms had become rags. Their faces were hollow from weeks of hiding in caves, surviving on whatever they could find. Some had injuries, burns, cuts, infected wounds that had gone untreated. All of them wore the same expression, the blank stare of people who had accepted death. The Americans found them in a collapsed hospital building where they had barricaded themselves in a basement room. When the Marines finally broke through the debris, the women screamed. Some tried to run, others simply froze their eyes wide with terror. 22-year-old Emiko stood near the back of the group, gripping a sharpened spoon she had spent hours grinding against concrete. She had been a radio operator before the world fell apart, before her fiancé died at Iwo Jima, before everything she believed turned to ash. She thought about his last letter folded in her pocket until the paper had worn soft as cloth. "I promise I will survive this. Wait for me." But he had not survived, and she had broken his promise by surviving herself. That guilt ate at her like acid in her chest. At the front of the group, 34-year-old Hanako stepped forward with her hands raised. She had been a head nurse, a professional, someone who kept her composure even when shells were falling, even when her niece screamed with pain from an injury that was slowly getting infected. She spoke rapid Japanese that none of the Marines understood. Her voice was steady, but her hands shook, because she knew what came next. Everyone knew. The propaganda had been brutally clear about what American soldiers did to Japanese women. Then a voice spoke in Japanese, clear, perfect Japanese. "We are not going to hurt you. The war is over. You are prisoners of war. You will be treated according to the Geneva Convention." The words came from a Japanese-American soldier, a man who looked like them but wore an American uniform, a man who had spent the entire war fighting against the country his parents had come from. The women stared at him in confusion. Geneva Convention. They had never heard of it. In all their military training and all their indoctrination, there had been no mention of rules about how to treat prisoners. There had only been one message: do not surrender. Die with honor instead. Hanako found her voice. "You are lying. This is a trick." The translator turned to the Marine sergeant standing behind him, a tall man with hard eyes and a face carved from stone. Sergeant James Wilson, 31 years old, from a small town in Georgia. His younger brother had burned alive on the USS Arizona at Pearl Harbor. Wilson had volunteered the next day. He had spent 4 years fighting across the Pacific with one thought burning in his mind: revenge. Now he looked down at these 47 Japanese women and felt something he did not expect: disgust with himself, because they were not soldiers. They were just people, scared people, some of them barely older than his sister back home. "Tell them we are taking them to a camp," Wilson said quietly to the translator. "Tell them they will be fed. They will be safe." He stopped, struggled with something inside himself, then added even more quietly, "Tell them we are Americans. We do not do what they think we are going to do." But the women did not believe him. How could they? Every piece of propaganda, every radio broadcast, every warning from their officers had told them the same thing. Americans were barbarians. Americans tortured prisoners. Americans showed no honor. And yet, what happened next began to crack those certainties like ice under spring sun. The Marines started handing things down into the basement, canteens of water, packages of crackers, and then impossibly a chocolate bar. Private First Class Robert Martinez, a baby-faced kid from New Mexico, handed his personal chocolate ration to 19-year-old Ayumi. She was closest to him, standing there with tears streaming down her face, convinced she was about to die. He smiled, a genuine smile with no cruelty in it. He gestured that she should eat it. Ayumi stared at the chocolate like it might be poisoned. She looked at Hanako. Hanako looked at the American soldiers searching for the trap, the moment when kindness would transform into violence. But Martinez just kept smiling, his hand still extended. Patient. Ayumi took it with shaking hands. She peeled back the wrapper, broke off a tiny piece and placed it on her tongue. Real chocolate. American chocolate. Sweet and rich and nothing like the bitter substitute they had eaten in Japan before even that disappeared. She started crying, not from fear this time, from the taste of something good in a world that had been nothing but bitter for so long. The Marines helped them climb out of the basement, helped them with gentle hands like they actually mattered, loaded them onto trucks with care, making sure the wounded were comfortable. The November heat pressed down like a weight even as evening approached. The air tasted of ash and salt water. Around them, the island groaned with the sounds of American occupation. Trucks grinding through mud, generators humming, distant voices shouting in English. To the Japanese women, every sound was a threat. Emiko sat in the back of the covered truck, squeezed between two other women gripping the side as they bounced over cratered roads. Through gaps in the canvas, she caught glimpses of the devastation. It was worse than she had imagined. Entire villages reduced to foundations and ash. Palm trees stripped bare, looking like giant broken bones reaching toward the sky, and bodies. Japanese bodies still lying where they had fallen. The Americans had not gotten to all of them yet. The smell was overwhelming. Even through the canvas, even with the ocean breeze, that sweet, sick smell of death was everywhere. Emiko had almost gotten used to it in the basement, but seeing it connected to actual bodies, actual people who had been alive and were now just meat rotting in the tropical heat, brought it all crashing back. Ayumi vomited over the side of the truck. An American soldier immediately passed up a canteen of water for the woman who had just thrown up, the enemy, the prisoner. Hanako sat across from Emiko, watching everything with sharp nurse eyes, processing, trying to understand. Her hands gripped her knees, knuckles white with tension. "They are taking us somewhere," Hanako said quietly in Japanese. "But where and why be kind if they are just going to do it anyway?" She did not finish, did not need to. They all knew what she meant. Why feed them, give them water, show them gentleness if the plan was to hurt them later? Was it not worse somehow to give hope and then crush it? More cruel than just being cruel from the start. Maybe they actually mean to keep us safe, Emiko started to say, but the words died in her throat. It sounded absurd even in her own mind. Americans did not keep Japanese safe. Americans dropped atomic bombs on cities. Americans had killed hundreds of thousands. The truck lurched to a stop, voices outside in English. The canvas was pulled back and bright work lights flooded in, making them squint. It was full night now, but the camp was lit up like daytime with huge electric lights. Another show of American resources that was almost as intimidating as weapons would have been. The women were ordered out. Most climbed down slowly, legs shaking from exhaustion and fear. Two had to be carried by their companions, too weak from weeks of starvation and hiding. That was when Emiko saw him. Sergeant Wilson. He stood apart from the other soldiers, arms crossed, face like stone. He was not smiling like Martinez, was not trying to be reassuring like some of the others. He just stood there watching them with eyes that held something Emiko could not quite name. It was not hatred exactly. It was harder than that, colder. He said something to the translator. The translator looked uncomfortable, shook his head slightly. Wilson said something else more forcefully. The translator reluctantly began speaking in Japanese. "Hermanos, you will be processed. You will be given medical attention. You will be housed here." The words were simple, businesslike, empty of threat, but the women did not believe them. Words were easy. Actions would tell the truth. They were lined up outside a long wooden building surrounded by barbed wire. A prisoner of war camp. The women looked at each other, their faces showing the same thought. This is where it ends. Years of propaganda had filled their minds with stories. American soldiers were savages who tortured prisoners. American soldiers showed no honor, no respect for women. American soldiers would do unspeakable things. The women had heard these warnings from officers, from radio broadcasts, from government newspapers. Every Japanese citizen knew what capture meant. Hanako whispered to the women near her in Japanese, "Stay together. Be strong. Remember you are daughters of Japan." Some of the younger women began to cry quietly. Others simply stared straight ahead, their jaws clenched, trying to show the dignity they had been taught since childhood. An American officer approached with the translator. The officer said something and the translator spoke. "You will be processed. You will be given medical attention. You will be housed here." Wait, they had expected immediate violence, immediate degradation. Instead, they were being spoken to, calmly directed with gestures rather than pushed with rifle butts. The cognitive dissonance was almost as frightening as outright brutality would have been. What were the Americans waiting for? They were taken into the building one at a time. The waiting was torture. Each woman who disappeared through the door might never come back. Those who remained outside whispered prayers, gripped each other's hands, tried not to imagine what was happening inside. When Emiko's turn came, she felt her legs nearly give out. She walked toward what she believed would be her assault or execution, with her head high, determined to show no weakness. Two female American nurses met her inside. Female nurses. Emiko stopped, confused. The nurses smiled gently and gestured for her to sit. Through the translator, they explained they needed to examine her for injuries and illness. The exam was clinical, professional, gentle. They cleaned the cut on her arm that had become infected. They checked her eyes, her throat, her lungs. When they found she was severely malnourished, and one nurse made notes on a clipboard while the other squeezed Emiko's shoulder sympathetically. No one hit her, no one touched her inappropriately, no one even raised their voice. When it was over, they handed her a cup of water and told her to drink slowly. Emiko drank, her hands shaking so badly that water spilled down her chin. She kept waiting for the trap to spring, for the kindness to reveal itself as mockery. It never came. One by one, the women went through the same process. Each emerged looking dazed, confused, almost disappointed in a strange way. Their expectations of horror had been denied, leaving them floating in uncertainty. Hanako came out last. She had expected the worst for herself, had steeled herself to endure it with dignity. Instead, the American doctor had treated her knee injury, which had been causing her pain for weeks, with the care of a professional. He had examined her like she mattered, not as enemy, as patient. After the medical examinations, they were directed to another room. Inside stood several large metal tubs filled with water. Steam rose from them, curling in the electric light. The women stared. Hot water, for bathing. They looked at each other, then at the American nurses supervising, searching for the humiliation they expected. The nurses simply handed them soap and towels and told them through the translator to wash. The soap was white industrial, nothing like the delicate soaps from home, but it was real soap and it smelled clean. Emiko picked up a bar and turned it over in her hands, feeling its weight. She had not been truly clean in over a month. None of them had. They had lived in caves and bunkers in the ruins of buildings with no running water, no way to wash properly. They undressed awkwardly, trying to maintain modesty even in their state. The hot water was almost painful at first, scalding against skin that had become sensitive. But as they sank into it, as the heat worked into their muscles, some of the women began to weep. Not from fear, from relief so intense it hurt. After bathing, they were given simple cotton garments to wear. Not uniforms, not prison clothes, just plain shirts and pants, clean and whole. Then they were led to a mess hall. The smell hit them before they entered. Rice, real rice, not the mixture of barley and weeds they had been eating toward the end when supplies had stopped coming. Real white rice. The mess hall was a large tent with wooden tables and benches. American soldiers ate on one side. A section had been cleared for the Japanese women. The women sat slowly, uncertain, watching the Americans for any sign of mockery or trap. The soldiers mostly ignored them, focused on their own meals and conversation. Then the food came, trays placed in front of each woman, white rice steaming and fluffy, grilled fish, miso soup clearly made by someone who knew Japanese cooking, pickled vegetables, and hot tea, green tea served in simple cups. The women stared at the food as if it might be a mirage. Hanako picked up her chopsticks with trembling hands. She had not seen a full meal like this in 6 months. Rations on Saipan had dwindled to almost nothing as the Americans closed in. They had eaten weeds roots, anything they could find. 3 women in their unit had died of starvation before the surrender. She took a bite of rice. The texture, the taste, the warmth. It flooded her senses. She closed her eyes and a tear rolled down her cheek. Around her, other women began to eat. Some ate slowly, savoring every bite. Others ate quickly, almost frantically, as if afraid the food would be taken away. A few could not eat at all, too overwhelmed, too confused by the contradiction of it. Emiko ate her miso soup in small sips, the warmth spreading through her chest. She thought of her mother's kitchen, of meals before the war, of normalcy that seemed a lifetime ago. The soup tasted almost like home. How could the enemy know how to make miso soup? How could the enemy care enough to try to? Yumi suddenly dropped her chopsticks. She covered her face with her hands and began to sob. Not quiet crying, deep wrenching sobs that shook her entire body. The sound echoed through the tent. Some of the American soldiers looked over concerned. A female nurse approached and knelt beside Ayumi, speaking softly even though Ayumi could not understand English. The translator came over. "What is wrong? Are you hurt?" Ayumi shook her head, unable to speak. Hanako answered for her in Japanese. "She is confused. We were told you would hurt us. Instead, you feed us." The translator relayed this to the nurse, who nodded slowly, her face showing something like sadness. She patted Ayumi's shoulder and stood up, leaving the women to their meal. After eating, they were given more tea. Some of the women had eaten too much, their stomachs unused to full meals, and felt sick. But even the nausea felt like a blessing compared to the gnawing emptiness of starvation. As they sipped their tea, they looked at each other across the tables, seeing the same confusion reflected in every face. What was happening? Why were they being treated this way? Was it a trick to make them compliant before the real punishment began? Or was something else going on? Something that did not fit anything they had been taught about the enemy. As darkness fell, they were taken to their barracks. It was a simple wooden structure raised slightly off the ground with screens on the windows to keep out insects. Inside, rows of cots lined the walls. Each cot had a thin mattress, a pillow, and a folded blanket. After months of sleeping on cave floors or concrete, the sight of actual beds made several women stop in the doorway. They filed in slowly, each choosing a cot. Amiko sat on hers and tested the mattress. It was thin, military issue, nothing luxurious. But it was a bed. She lay back, feeling the pillow under her head, and stared at the ceiling. The barracks smelled of wood and canvas, clean and dry. Outside, she could hear American voices, the sound of trucks, someone laughing. An American guard, a young corporal who looked barely 20, brought in a kerosene lamp and hung it from a hook in the center of the room. He said something in English that none of them understood, then paused at the door. He seemed to be trying to think of what to say. Finally, he just nodded and left, pulling the door closed behind him, but not locking it. The women heard his footsteps moving away. Silence fell over the barracks. They lay in their cots, still dressed in the clothes they had been given, too afraid to relax completely. Hanako broke the silence, speaking in Japanese. "We should take turns staying awake, to keep watch." Several women murmured agreement. They organized shifts. 4 women awake at a time while the others attempted to sleep. But sleep would not come easily. Every sound outside made them tense. Footsteps approaching, then passing by. Voices calling to each other in English. A truck starting up. The tropical night was full of unfamiliar noises, and each one could be a threat. Emiko lay with her eyes open, watching the shadows move across the ceiling as the lamp flame flickered. Around midnight, they heard footsteps approaching the barracks. Multiple people. The women who were supposed to be sleeping sat up. Hearts began to pound. This was it. Whatever the Americans had been planning, it was happening now. In the darkness. When they were isolated and vulnerable. The footsteps stopped outside the door. Hanako stood up, her face set with determination. If they were coming for the women, they would have to go through her first. Other women quietly picked up anything that could serve as a weapon: a shoe, a belt. One woman had hidden a sharp piece of metal from the ruins. They waited, barely breathing, as the door handle turned. The door opened. 3 Americans stood there, 2 soldiers and a female nurse. They carried bundles in their arms. The nurse spoke, and the translator's voice came from behind her. "The temperature drops at night. We brought extra blankets and tea." They walked in slowly, non-threateningly, and began placing wool blankets on the empty cots. One of the soldiers carried a large thermos and a stack of cups. The women stared, their makeshift weapons forgotten. Blankets, hot tea. The nurse smiled at them, a genuine smile with no trace of hypocrisy, and poured tea into cups, handing them out. "Sleep well," the translator said. Then they left, closing the door quietly behind them. For a long moment, nobody moved. Then Ayumi started laughing. It was a strange, almost hysterical laugh, but not unkind. "Blankets," she said in Japanese. "They brought us blankets." Other women began to laugh too. The sound mixed with crying, a release of tension so powerful it left them shaking. Emiko picked up one of the blankets and wrapped it around her shoulders. It was thick, warm, and smelled faintly of storage and mothballs. She held her cup of tea in both hands, feeling the heat seep into her palms. This was real. This was actually happening. The enemy had brought them blankets and tea. That night marked a turning point. Not trust, not yet, but the beginning of something. A crack in the certainty they had built their entire understanding upon. The women slept more soundly than they had in months, wrapped in American blankets, in American beds, behind American guards who did not hurt them. It was confusing and frightening in its own way, but it was also undeniably real. Morning came with the sound of a bell. The women woke slowly, disoriented, having to remember where they were. Sunlight streamed through the screened windows, warm and golden. The door opened, and the same young corporal from the night before gestured for them to come out. They filed into the morning, blinking in the bright tropical sun. Breakfast was served in the same mess tent: rice porridge, fish, pickles, and hot tea. A simple meal, but more food than they had seen in months. After breakfast, they were organized into work groups. Through the translator, they learned they would be assigned to help with laundry cleaning and food preparation. Light work. The translator emphasized they would be paid in camp script that could be used at a small canteen. The work was indeed light, especially compared to the harsh conditions they had endured on Saipan. Emiko was assigned to help with laundry, washing sheets and towels in large tubs. The work was mundane, repetitive, and oddly comforting. It gave her something to focus on besides her confusion and fear. The American soldiers they worked alongside were mostly polite, sometimes awkward. Many were young, barely older than the Japanese women. They communicated through gestures and simple words. One soldier, a tall man from somewhere called Minnesota, tried to teach Emiko the English word for soap. He pointed at the soap, said soap several times, then grinned when she repeated it back to him. It was such a normal human interaction that it left Emiko feeling off balance for hours afterward. Days turned into a routine. Wake at dawn, breakfast, work detail, lunch, more work, dinner, evening in the barracks. The sameness of it was both reassuring and unsettling. Where was the cruelty they had expected? Where was the degradation? The Americans treated them like prisoners of war. Not honored guests, certainly, but not monsters either. Just prisoners to be housed and fed according to some set of rules the women did not fully understand. But understanding would come, slowly, painfully, through moments both small and devastating. And it would all lead to one cold December night when a storm would blow in from the ocean and 47 Japanese women would finally understand what their enemy had been trying to tell them all along. That humanity is not about who wins. It is about what you refuse to do, even when you have the power to do it. But that lesson was still months away. For now, in these first days of captivity, they were simply trying to survive the kindness of their enemy, which turned out to be far more difficult than surviving their cruelty would have been. The camp had a small canteen where prisoners could buy items with their work script. The first time the women were allowed to visit, they approached it like explorers entering unknown territory. Inside, the shelves held items that seemed impossible. Chocolate bars wrapped in bright paper, cigarettes in neat packages, writing paper and pencils, small toiletries like toothbrushes and combs. Hanako stood in front of the chocolate display staring. Real chocolate. American chocolate. The price was listed in script affordable after a week of work. She picked up a bar, feeling its weight in her hand. Its realness. In Japan, chocolate had become impossible to find years ago. Everything had been rationed, then rationed, more than disappeared entirely. And here in a prisoner of war camp, she could buy chocolate. She thought of her daughter in Tokyo, 7 years old now, a little girl who had never tasted chocolate, who was probably starving if she was still alive at all. While her mother stood in an American canteen, well-fed holding chocolate she could actually afford to buy. The guilt was crushing. She bought the bar anyway, placed it carefully in her small footlocker back at the barracks. That night she broke off a single square and let it melt on her tongue. The sweetness was almost painful. It tasted like betrayal. Amiko noticed the changes in her own body with a mixture of relief and shame. After 2 weeks of regular meals, her face had filled out. Her skin, which had been sallow and dry, had begun to clear. Her hair, once dull and brittle, was regaining its shine. She was getting healthier, growing stronger. While Tokyo burned, while her family, if they still lived, scavenged for food in the ruins. She caught her reflection in a window one afternoon and barely recognized herself. This woman with full cheeks and clear eyes. This woman who no longer looked like she was dying. "Is this what defeat looks like?" she wrote in her diary that night. Not death, but this obscene health bought with enemy rice. But the real fractures began to show in the third week when the tensions between the women finally broke into open conflict. It happened during an evening in the barracks. Ayumi had returned from the canteen with a small comb, excited about the purchase. She sat on her cot, running it through her hair, which had grown tangled during their weeks of hiding. Reiko watched her from across the room. 29 years old, rigid as steel keeper of the old certainties. She had not smiled once since their capture, had not spoken to the American guards except when absolutely necessary. "You look happy," Reiko said in Japanese. Her voice was flat, but the accusation underneath was sharp. Ayumi stopped mid-stroke, the comb frozen in her hair. She started. "It is nice to have a comb again." "Is it?" Reiko stood up. "Is it nice to use American money to buy American goods while you work for American masters?" The barracks went quiet, every woman watching. Ayumi's face crumpled. "I did not mean anything by it. I just wanted to fix my hair." "Your hair," Reiko's voice roars. "Your hair matters while Japan burns, while our people starve. You sit here combing your hair, growing fat on their food, learning their words, smiling at their soldiers." "That is not fair," Hanako said quietly from her cot. "She is just a girl. She is old enough to remember who she is," Reiko snapped, "or who she was supposed to be," before we all started forgetting. The words hung in the air like smoke, because they all felt it, the slow erosion of their certainty, the daily betrayal of their own comfort. "We have not forgotten anything," Hanako said, standing up. Her knee protested, but she ignored it. "We are surviving. That is what we were trained to do. We were trained to J before surrendering," Reiko shot back. "We were trained to preserve our honor. Instead, we sit here like pets, grateful for their scraps." "They are not scraps," one of the younger women said quietly. "They are meals, real meals, better than what we had even before things got bad." The admission was damning. Everyone knew it was true. The food here in this prisoner of war camp was better than what they had eaten in Japan before the war became desperate, better than what military rations had been, better than what most Japanese civilians had seen in years. "So we should be grateful." Reiko's voice shook. "Grateful to the people who dropped atomic bombs on our cities, who killed hundreds of thousands. We should smile and learn their language and comb our hair." "What would you have us do?" Hanako asked, her voice tired. "Starve ourselves to prove a point, refuse their medicine and die of infection? Would that preserve our honor?" "It would preserve something," Reiko said. "Something more important than this." She gestured around the barracks. "This comfort, this slow forgetting of who we are." Ayumi was crying now silently, her new comb clutched in her hands. Amiko stood up. She had been writing in her diary, trying to stay out of it, but she could not anymore. "Reiko," she said carefully, "why do you hate this so much? Not the Americans. This, us, surviving." Reiko turned to her, and for the first time her mask cracked. "Because," she said, her voice breaking, Because if they are not monsters, then what does that make us? The question landed like a bomb, because if they are not monsters, Reiko continued, then the stories were lies, the propaganda was lies. Everything we were told about dying with honor, about the righteousness of our cause, about the barbarism of the enemy. All lies. She sat down heavily on her cot. And if those were lies, then my brother died for nothing. The barracks was silent now. Outside, someone was playing a harmonica. The tune was sad and sweet. Your brother, Hanako asked gently. Executed, Reiko said. 2 years ago, for defeatist talk. He said in a letter to our mother that perhaps Japan could not win, that perhaps we should seek peace before more people died. Someone reported him. They called it treason. She looked up at them, her eyes dry but devastated. They killed him for telling the truth. And I supported it. I believed he was weak. That questioning was betrayal. That loyalty meant believing everything we were told no matter what our eyes saw. No one knew what to say. So yes, Reiko continued, I hate this. Because every kind word from these Americans, every meal, every blanket, proves that my brother was right, and that I helped kill him by believing he was wrong. Ayumi crossed the room and sat beside Reiko. She did not say anything, just sat there holding her new comb, letting her presence be comfort. After a long moment, Hanako spoke. We are all guilty of believing, she said. We all supported this war in our own ways. We cannot change that. But perhaps we can learn from it. Learn what Reiko asked bitterly. That enemies can choose mercy, Hanako said. That rules matter even in war. That the people we were taught to hate are capable of more humanity than the people who taught us to hate them. The words settled over them like dust. That night, the women talked until dawn. About the war, about the propaganda, about the lies they had been told and the lies they had told themselves. About guilt and survival and what it meant to be Japanese in a world where Japan had lost everything. It was dangerous territory, treasonous territory, just months before such talk would have gotten them arrested, tortured, killed. But here in this American prison, they were free to question everything. The irony was not lost on any of them. The breakthrough with Hanako came a week later when her knee finally became too painful to ignore. She had been hiding the severity of it, not wanting to show weakness, not wanting to accept more help from the Americans. But one morning she could barely walk. The joint was swollen hot to the touch, clearly infected. Captain Margaret Chen noticed immediately. She was the chief medical officer, a Chinese-American woman of 38, who carried herself with quiet authority. She had her own reasons for hating the Japanese. Her family had suffered under Japanese occupation in China. Her uncle had been killed in Nanjing. But she was a doctor first, and when she saw Hanako limping, she made a decision that had nothing to do with politics or revenge. You need to see the doctor, she told Hanako through the translator. That infection could cost you your leg. Hanako wanted to refuse, wanted to tough it out. But the pain was unbearable, and she knew Chen was right. They took her to the camp medical facility, a clean, well-equipped building that seemed impossible. She had worked in Japanese military hospitals. She knew what medical facilities looked like when resources were scarce. This was not that. The American doctor examined her knee carefully. He was gentle, explaining everything he was doing through the translator, treating her like a patient rather than an enemy. Then came something that seemed like magic, an X-ray machine. Hanako had heard of such technology but never seen it. The doctor positioned her leg and the machine hummed to life. Minutes later, he showed her images of her own bones. The inside of her knee joint visible as if through water. The joint is damaged here, he explained, pointing to the X-ray. See this? The cartilage is torn. The infection has spread into the surrounding tissue. We will need to treat this aggressively or you will have permanent damage. He prescribed rest antibiotics and physical therapy. All of this for a prisoner, for the enemy. Over the next 3 weeks, an American physical therapist worked with Hanako daily. A young man from Wisconsin who spoke slowly and used gestures to communicate. He was patient, encouraging, genuinely invested in her recovery. One day he showed her a photograph from his wallet. An older woman in nurse whites. Your mother, Hanako asked through gestures. He nodded, smiled. She was a nurse too, he managed to convey. In the last war. And in that moment, Hanako saw it. The thing that changed everything. This young American man was just a person, with a mother who had been a nurse, with a life and a family and a history that had nothing to do with propaganda or politics. He was not her enemy. He was just someone doing his job with kindness, because that was the right way to do it. When Sergeant Wilson came to check on the medical unit that afternoon, he found Hanako walking without pain for the first time in months. She bowed to him slightly, a gesture of respect that surprised them both. Wilson stood there awkwardly. He had been avoiding the women as much as possible, uncomfortable with their presence, uncomfortable with his own complicated feelings about them. "You are recovering well," he said through the translator. "Yes," Hanako replied in Japanese. "Thank you." Wilson nodded and turned to leave, but Hanako spoke again. The translator conveyed her words. "Why do you do this? Treat us this way. We are your enemy." Wilson stopped, turned back. He looked at her for a long moment, and she saw something in his eyes, pain, grief, and underneath it a kind of tired resignation. "My brother died at Pearl Harbor," he said quietly, "burned alive on his ship. For 4 years I have hated every Japanese person I have ever seen. I wanted you all dead, every single one of you." Hanako held his gaze unflinching. "But you are not soldiers," Wilson continued. "You are support staff, nurses and radio operators and typists. You are just people who got caught in this thing same as everyone else. And I have a sister your age back home. And I keep thinking if she had been over here on the other side, would I want someone to treat her the way I wanted to treat you?" He paused. "The answer is no. So we follow the rules. We treat you according to the Geneva Convention. Not because you deserve it, not because we like you, but because we are Americans. And we have rules about what we will and will not do, even to our enemies." The translator finished. Hanako stood there absorbing it. Rules that applied even to enemies. Mercy not as kindness, but as principle. This was something entirely outside her understanding of war. "Your brother," she said carefully, "I am sorry for your loss. Many of us have lost family too. This war has taken so much from everyone." Wilson nodded once curtly, then he left. But something had shifted between them. A recognition of shared humanity, of shared grief. It was not friendship, but it was something. The music moment came on a quiet afternoon in late November. Emiko was hanging laundry in the sun when she heard it, a harmonica playing a melody that ached with longing. The tune was unfamiliar, but the feeling in it was universal. Homesickness, loss, the weight of being far from everything you loved. She stopped working and listened. The sound came from a soldier sitting on the steps of a nearby building. He played with his eyes closed, lost in the music. When he finished, he opened his eyes and saw her watching. For a moment, they just looked at each other across the distance. Then he smiled slightly and started playing again. This tune was different, more upbeat, almost playful. Emiko found herself humming along, trying to match the melody. The soldier's smile widened. He played more, exaggerating the notes, turning it into a kind of musical conversation. When he finally stopped, Emiko bowed slightly, without thinking. The soldier laughed, not mockingly, but with pleasure. Then he stood, bowed back in an exaggerated American attempt at Japanese courtesy, and went inside. It was such a small moment, just music and a shared smile. But Emiko thought about it for days, because music transcended language. Music said, "I am a human being with feelings, and you are too." These small connections accumulated over the weeks. A guard helping carry a heavy basket of laundry. A soldier showing pictures of his family back in Iowa, his finger pointing to each person while he said their names slowly. An American cook asking through gestures if the miso soup was seasoned correctly, genuinely wanting to get it right. Each interaction chipped away at the certainty that these were monsters. Each moment of ordinary human decency made it harder to maintain the hate they had been taught. And that was more terrifying than cruelty would have been, because cruelty fit the narrative. Cruelty made sense. Cruelty allowed them to remain who they had been. But kindness destroyed everything. The Americans organized a movie night in mid-November. A screen was set up in the camp yard, and a projector showed American films. The Japanese women were invited to attend. Most went curious despite themselves. The film was in English, which they did not understand, but it was a comedy and physical humor translated. A man slipping on a banana peel. A chase scene through a department store. Exaggerated expressions and pratfalls. Women who had not laughed in months found themselves giggling. found themselves caught up in the silly joy of it, found themselves for just an hour forgetting they were prisoners. Ayumi laughed so hard at one scene that she snorted, then covered her mouth in embarrassment. The American soldier sitting near her laughed too, not at her, but with her sharing the moment. Afterward, walking back to their barracks, the women were quiet. Something had shifted again. They had spent an evening being entertained by their captors, had laughed at American humor, had shared space with American soldiers without fear. It felt like crossing a line they had not meant to cross. Amiko lay awake that night, staring at the ceiling. 2 months had passed since their capture. 2 months of regular meals, clean water work that did not break them, and Americans who treated them with a strange mixture of professionalism and casual kindness. Her body had responded to the change. She had gained weight. Her skin had cleared. Her hair was shiny again. She looked healthier than she had in years, and that felt like the deepest betrayal of all. She was a prisoner of war. She was supposed to be suffering. The emperor had asked his people to endure hardship, to sacrifice everything for Japan. And here she was, growing strong on American rice, sleeping in American beds, laughing at American movies. She thought about Tokyo, about her family. Were they eating? Did they have shelter? Her father would be devastated by the defeat. He had been so proud when she joined the military auxiliary, so certain Japan would prevail. What would he think if he could see her mom healthy and fed by the enemy? The contradiction gnawed at her constantly. She had been taught that Americans were barbaric, that they had no honor, no respect for others. But everything she experienced contradicted this. The Americans had rules. They followed protocols. They treated prisoners according to international agreements she had never heard of before capture. When someone was sick, they provided medical care. When someone was cold, they provided blankets. But if the propaganda about Americans was false, what else had been false? The question terrified her. She had built her entire understanding of the war, of her role, of her duty, on the foundation of that propaganda. If the foundation crumbled, what was left? I do not know who I am anymore, she wrote in her diary. I was a Japanese woman loyal to the emperor, ready to die for my country. Now I am a prisoner who eats American food and sleeps in American blankets and feels grateful for both. Is this what defeat means? Not death, but the slow dissolution of everything you believed. The answer came on a cold December evening in a way none of them expected. But first they would have to face something even more devastating than kindness. They would have to face the truth about what their country had become, what the war had done, what had been lost while they were being kept safe and fed by the people they had been taught to hate. That truth arrived on a film reel in grainy black and white footage that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. Captain Chen gathered them in the mess hall one evening. Her face was serious. What you are about to see, she said through the translator, is difficult. But you need to understand what has happened to your country. The projector started, and on the screen appeared images of Japan, Hiroshima, Nagasaki, Tokyo. The cities were gone, not damaged, not partially destroyed. Gone, reduced to ash and rubble, and the twisted skeletons of buildings. The footage showed survivors wandering through ruins, children with burns covering their bodies, women searching desperately for family members, the atomic bomb destruction, the firebombing aftermath, the complete devastation. The women watched in silence. Many were crying openly. This was what their homeland looked like now. This was what the war had done. Emiko thought of her neighborhood in Tokyo and felt certain it was gone. All of it, her home, her school, the shops she had known since childhood, all turned to ash by American bombs. The Americans sitting around them watching the same footage did not look triumphant. Some looked uncomfortable. Some looked sad. One young soldier got up and left his face pale. They were not celebrating the destruction. They were showing it to the prisoners, not as a boast, but as information, as context, as truth. When the film ended, the silence in the hall was absolute. Captain Chen stood up. She looked at the women with something in her eyes that might have been sympathy. The war is over, she said quietly. Japan is being rebuilt. Your families, if they survived, are receiving aid. American aid. Food, medicine, supplies. She paused. We are not your friends, but we are no longer your enemies. We are all just people trying to survive what happened. The words were simple, But they carried weight. That night, the women talked until dawn. About home, about what they would find when they returned, about whether they could return, whether there was anything to return to. And underneath it all, unspoken but understood, was a new and terrible realization. The war had destroyed Japan, but the peace was being built by the very people they had been taught to see as devils. American food was feeding Japanese children. American medicine was treating Japanese wounded. American engineers were helping to rebuild Japanese cities. The ideology they had been raised with had been shattered as completely as those cities in the film. And in 3 weeks, a cold December storm would force them to confront the final truth, the one that would stay with them forever. That mercy is not weakness, that rules are not chains, and that sometimes the greatest victory is not in winning but in choosing humanity even when you have the power to choose cruelty. But that night was still ahead. For now they lay in their cots wrapped in American blankets, warm and fed and safe while their world burned in their minds. And they wept for everything they had lost, including their certainty about who their enemy really was. The announcement came in early December, carried by the translator through the barracks like wind before rain. You will be sent home soon. Repatriation has been approved. Processing will begin next week. The word should have brought joy, should have brought relief, should have brought something other than the cold dread that settled in Emiko's stomach like a stone. Home. The word had lost its meaning. Home was ash now. Home was a photograph in her mind that no longer existed in reality. Home was people who might be dead, a city that had been erased, a life that could never be recovered. Around her, the other women showed the same confusion. This was what they had wanted, was it not, to go back to Japan, to see their families again, to leave this place where they were prisoners? Except they were not sure anymore if that was what they wanted. Ayumi spoke what many were thinking, but few would say aloud. I am afraid, she whispered that night in the barracks. I am afraid to go home. The admission hung in the darkness. Shameful. Honest. Hanako sat up on her cot. Her knee no longer hurt thanks to weeks of American medical care. Her body was stronger than it had been in years, and that strength felt like evidence of some terrible crime. We must return, she said, but her voice lacked conviction. Japan is our home. No matter what we find there, we must return and help rebuild. But how, Reiko asked from across the room. Her voice was different now than it had been weeks ago. Softer, broken in places. How do we face people who suffered while we were fed? How do we explain that we were kept safe by the enemy? No one had an answer. The processing began 3 days later. Medical examinations to ensure they were fit to travel, documentation, lists and forms in triplicate. The bureaucracy of return. Captain Chen met with each woman individually. These meetings were ostensibly about health, but they became something else, something closer to confession. When Emiko's turn came, she sat across from Chen in the small medical office. Chen looked at her chart, then set it aside. You have gained 12 pounds since you arrived, Chen said through the translator. Your blood pressure is normal. The infection in your arm has healed completely. You are healthier now than when we found you. Emiko nodded, unable to speak past the guilt. Chen leaned forward. You will face difficulties when you return home, she said quietly. People will judge you for surviving, for looking healthy, for being here. Her eyes were kind, despite the hard truth she spoke. But you are strong. You survived the war. You survived us. You will survive what comes next. The words were meant to be comforting. They only made Emiko feel worse. Because surviving the Americans had not felt like survival. It had felt like betrayal, like slow seduction away from everything she was supposed to be. Thank you, she managed to say, for the care you have given us. Chen smiled sadly. We did what the rules required, nothing more. But Emiko heard the lie in it, because the blankets at night had not been required. The chocolate had not been required. The harmonica music and the movie nights and the gentle physical therapy had not been required. The Americans had chosen to be kind when they could have chosen anything else. The days before departure felt strange, liminal. The women moved through their routines, but everything had the quality of a dream ending. Soon they would wake up in a different world, a harder world, a world where kindness was not guaranteed and rules might not apply. Sergeant Wilson began to change in those final days. The walls he had built around himself started to crack in visible ways. He sought out the women during work details. not to supervise, but to talk. Through the translator, he asked about their families, about Tokyo, about what they hoped to find when they returned. One afternoon, he found Hanako folding laundry in the sun. He stood awkwardly for a moment, then spoke. "I wanted to apologize," he said through Jimmy Tanaka, "for how I was at the beginning, for the hatred I carried." Hanako looked up at him. This tall American man with sad eyes who had lost his brother at Pearl Harbor. "You had reason to hate," she said simply. "Maybe," Wilson replied, "but hate did not bring my brother back. It just made me less than who I wanted to be." He pulled something from his pocket, a photograph worn soft from being carried. He showed it to her. A young man in navy whites grinning at the camera, maybe 20 years old. "This was him," Wilson said. "Tommy. He wanted to be a teacher after the war. Wanted to teach history. Can you believe that kid loved books more than anything?" His voice cracked slightly. "He would have hated what I became. Would have been ashamed of the things I thought about doing to prisoners before I met you all." Hanako studied the photograph. "He looks kind," she said, "like someone who would have been a good teacher." Wilson nodded, took the photo back, tucked it away carefully. "He was. And I dishonored his memory by carrying that hate. So I am apologizing. To you, to all of you, for what I thought, for what I almost did." Hanako bowed deeply, the formal bow of respect. "Your brother would be proud of who you chose to become." Instead, she said. Wilson returned the bow, clumsy but sincere. Then he walked away quickly, his shoulders shaking in a way that suggested he was crying and did not want her to see. The storm arrived on December 15th, 3 days before their scheduled departure. It came from the ocean, rolling in with dark clouds that turned afternoon into premature night. The temperature dropped 20 degrees in an hour. Rain began to fall in sheets, driven sideways by wind that howled like something alive and angry. The women huddled in their barracks as the storm intensified. The thin walls provided little protection against the cold. The heating system, which had never worked well, chose that night to fail completely. Within an hour, they were shivering. Within 2 hours, their teeth were chattering. Within 3 hours, some of the older women were showing signs of hypothermia. Imiko wrapped her blanket tighter around herself, but the cold was penetrating, the kind of cold that sinks into bones. That makes you wonder if you will ever be warm again. Beside her, Ayumi was curled into a ball, shaking violently. Her lips had a blue tinge. Across the room, one of the older women had stopped shivering, which was worse. That meant her body was giving up. Hanako tried to organize them, put the weakest in the middle, share blankets, keep moving to generate heat, but it was not enough. The cold was winning. Then they heard vehicles outside, engines roaring through the storm, doors slamming, voices shouting in English. The old fear surged up immediately. Why were Americans coming now in the storm? In the darkness, the door burst open and 3 soldiers entered, soaked through water streaming from their uniforms. Behind them came Captain Chen and 2 nurses equally drenched. Behind them, Sergeant Wilson, carrying bundles wrapped in canvas to protect them from the rain. The translator rushed in last, shaking water from his jacket like a dog. "There is a problem with the heating system in this building," he said rapidly. "It cannot be fixed until morning. We are moving you to another barracks with working heat. Please gather your things quickly." The women scrambled to collect their few possessions. This seemed real, a practical response to a practical problem. But the old suspicion remained lurking beneath. Where were they really being taken? Out into the storm they went. The rain was cold as ice, soaking them instantly. The wind tore at their clothes. Lightning split the sky, illuminating the camp in stark flashes. The soldiers guided them carefully through the mud, hands steadying those who stumbled. Wilson himself carried one of the older women who could not walk, lifting her as gently as if she were made of glass. The new barracks was larger, closer to the main camp buildings. When they entered, heat washed over them like a blessing. A pot-belly stove glowed in the corner, radiating warmth. The bunks here were better, thicker mattresses, real pillows, and on each bunk 2 blankets instead of 1. At the foot of each bed sat a small package wrapped in brown paper. Captain Chen spoke, and the translator relayed her words, shouting slightly over the sound of rain hammering the roof. "We apologize for the inconvenience. The packages contain warm socks, an extra shirt, and some small personal items. We also brought soup and tea." As if on cue, 2 soldiers wheeled in a cart. A large pot of soup steamed on top. Stacks of bowls. a container of hot tea. The smell of the soup filled the barracks. Something with chicken and vegetables. Simple but hot and real. The women stood frozen. Water dripped from their clothes onto the wooden floor. They were cold and wet and confused, and this was not a trick. This was genuine care in response to genuine need. The Americans had noticed they were suffering and had moved them to warmth, had provided not just necessities, but comforts, extra blankets, warm clothes, hot food on a cold night. Emiko felt something inside her crack open, not break, open, like ice melting, like a door she had been holding shut finally giving way. She sat on the nearest bunk and picked up her package with shaking hands. Inside were thick wool socks, a flannel shirt soft and warm, a comb, a bar of soap, and tucked at the bottom a small chocolate bar. Such simple things, such thoughtful things. She picked up the chocolate and started to cry. Not the silent tears she had shed before, deep sobs that shook her whole body. Around her, other women were having the same reaction. Ayumi clutched her new socks and wept. Another woman held a flannel shirt to her face, feeling its softness crying into the fabric. Hanako sat with her head bowed, her shoulders shaking. Even Reiko, rigid Reiko, who had fought so hard against accepting anything from the Americans, stared at her package with tears streaming down her face. Her hands trembled as she pulled out the chocolate. Why, she whispered in Japanese, why do they do this? Captain Chen moved among them. She did not need translation to understand what was happening. She had seen it before. This moment when prisoners stopped seeing their captors as the enemy and started seeing them as people. It was always emotional, always difficult, always necessary for healing to begin. The women changed into dry clothes, the new shirts they had been given. They put on the wool socks and felt their feet finally grow warm. They ate their soup slowly, letting the heat spread through their chests. They drank their tea and felt life returning to their cold bodies. And as they settled into their new bunks under their extra blankets in the warmth of the heated barracks, something fundamental shifted. Not all at once, not completely, but enough. Enough to understand what Sergeant Wilson had been trying to tell them. Enough to grasp what Captain Chen had been showing them through her care. Enough to comprehend the lesson that the Americans had been teaching them from the moment that door first opened with the blankets instead of rifles. That civilization is not about power. It is about restraint. It is about choosing mercy when you could choose cruelty. It is about following rules even when breaking them would be easier, even when no one would blame you for it. Emiko wrote in her diary that night by lamplight, her hands steadier than it had been in weeks. Tonight I understood something. The Americans do not treat us well because they are weak. They treat us well because they believe it is right. They have rules about how to treat prisoners. And they follow those rules even when it would be easier not to, even when we are the enemy, even when we might not deserve it. This is not weakness. This is something I had no word for in Japanese, but I understand it now. She paused, pen hovering over paper, then continued. If the propaganda about Americans was false, then everything else was false too. The righteousness of our cause, the necessity of the war, the glory of dying for the emperor. All lies. My fiancé died believing those lies. My country was destroyed pursuing those lies. Millions of people suffered and died because of those lies. Another pause, longer this time. When she wrote again, her handwriting was different, more certain. But I survived to learn the truth. And perhaps that is worth something. Perhaps that is my duty now, not to die with honor, but to live with truth, and to carry this lesson forward, that enemies can choose mercy, and that mercy is the greatest victory of all. Around her, the other women were settling into sleep, really settling, not the tense half-sleep of those first weeks waiting for violence, not the exhausted collapse of the weeks after, but actual rest, the kind that comes when you finally feel safe. No one organized watch shifts, no one clutched makeshift weapons, no one lay awake expecting the worst. They all slept, warm and fed and protected by people they had been taught to fear. Outside, the storm raged on. Rain hammered the roof, wind tore at the walls, lightning split the sky. But inside, 47 Japanese women rested in American blankets, in American bunks behind American guards, who had chosen humanity over hate. Morning came with pale sunlight breaking through thinning clouds. The storm had passed. The world looked washed clean, fresh, as if something old had been cleared away to make room for something new. The women woke slowly, rested in a way they had not been in months, maybe years. Hanako was the first to rise. She stood by the window looking out at the camp. Her knee did not hurt. Her body was strong. Her mind was clear. She thought about her daughter in Tokyo, 7 years old, growing up in the ruins of the old world. And she made a decision. She would return to Japan. She would find her daughter. She would help rebuild what had been destroyed. But she would not rebuild the old lies. She would not teach her daughter to hate. She would not pass on the poison that had led to so much suffering. She would teach her something else, something she had learned from her enemies. That rules matter. That mercy is not weakness. That civilization is measured not by how you treat your friends, but by how you treat those who have hurt you. The other women began to wake. Ayumi sat up and smiled, actually smiled, not the nervous, frightened expression she had worn for months. A real smile. The smile of someone who had survived something terrible and found unexpected grace on the other side. Even Reiko looked different. The rigid hardness in her face had softened. She still looked sad, would probably always carry that sadness for her brother. But she looked at peace with it now, at peace with surviving, at peace with learning the truth even though it hurt. Captain Chen arrived mid-morning with the translator. She looked at the women and nodded satisfied. The heating system in your old barracks has been repaired, she said, but you may stay here until you leave. It is more comfortable. The women bowed their thanks. Deep bows, respectful bows, not the fearful gestures of the first weeks, but genuine expressions of gratitude. That afternoon, the Americans organized a gathering, a farewell of sorts. The soldiers who had worked alongside the women were invited, the nurses, the medical staff, even the kitchen workers who had tried so hard to get the miso soup right. It was informal, awkward in places. The language barrier still made real conversation difficult. But there was laughter. There were shared memories conveyed through gestures and broken words. There were moments of connection that transcended language. Private Martinez found Ayumi and gave her his harmonica. I cannot play it as well as the other guys, anyway, he said through the translator. Maybe you can learn. Maybe it will remind you that not all Americans are so bad. Ayumi took it with tears in her eyes. Thank you, she said in careful English. Thank you for everything. The physical therapist who had worked with Hanako gave her a letter, addressed to a hospital in Tokyo. If you find work as a nurse again, he said, this letter explains some of the techniques we used. Maybe it will help. Hanako clutched the letter like treasure. It was more than medical information. It was a bridge, a connection between former enemies, a hope for continued healing. And Sergeant Wilson found Amiko near the end of the gathering. He held out a small wrapped package. She opened it carefully. Inside was a notebook, blank pages, clean and new. For your writing, he said simply, I noticed you keep a diary. Thought you might need more paper. Amiko looked at him. This man who had lost his brother, who had hated her people so deeply, who had chosen to be better than his hate. I will use it to write the truth, she said through the translator, about what happened here, about what you taught us. Wilson nodded, then unexpectedly he smiled, a real smile that reached his eyes. Truth is important, he said, maybe the most important thing. My brother knew that. I am glad you know it too. They bowed to each other. Two people on opposite sides of a terrible war, finding respect, finding understanding, finding a way forward that honored the dead without perpetuating the hate that killed them. The departure day arrived with typical military efficiency. The women were processed through final paperwork, given travel documents, assigned to groups for the journey. The ship that would take them home was waiting at the dock, a converted military transport, not comfortable but functional. It would take 2 weeks to reach Japan, 2 weeks to prepare themselves for what they would find. As they walked through the camp, one final time, the women looked at everything differently. The barracks that had been their home, the mess hall where they had been fed, the laundry area where Amiko had first heard the harmonica, the medical building where Hanako had learned to walk without pain. This place had been their prison, but it had also been their salvation. It had destroyed their certainties and built something new in their place, something better, something true. The guards lined up along the path to the trucks, an informal farewell. Roberts, the corporal who had tried so hard to learn Japanese, attempted one final phrase, sayonara. His pronunciation was terrible. The women laughed, but it was kind laughter, affectionate. Captain Chen stood near the trucks. As each woman passed, she shook their hands, Western style, formal but warm. To Hanako, she said, "Your strength will rebuild Japan. To Ayumi, your youth will bring hope. To Reiko, your truth will honor your brother. And to Amiko, your words will make sure this is remembered." The women climbed into the trucks, one last time, one last bumpy ride over cratered roads. But this time, they were not terrified. They were not expecting violence. They were simply traveling, from one chapter of their lives to the next. At the dock, as they boarded the ship, Emiko turned to look back at Saipan, at the camp, at the Americans standing in small groups watching them leave. She raised her hand in a wave, simple, human, an acknowledgement of shared experience, of lessons learned on both sides. Sergeant Wilson, standing apart from the others, as always, raised his hand in return, a salute that was also a goodbye, a recognition that they had changed each other, that neither would be the same again. The ship pulled away from the dock. The island grew smaller. The Americans became tiny figures and then vanished entirely. The women stood at the rail looking toward the horizon, toward Japan, toward home, toward whatever awaited them in the ruins of the old world. But they were different now. They carried something precious, something that could help rebuild not just buildings but hearts and minds. They carried the knowledge that enemies could choose mercy, that rules could transcend hate, that humanity was possible even in war. And they carried the memory of blankets on a cold night, of chocolate given freely, of medical care provided without question, of rules followed even when breaking them would have been easier. These memories would stay with them forever, would shape their lives, would be passed down to their children and grandchildren, would become part of the story of how Japan learned to rebuild. Not just as a nation, but as a people who had learned the hardest lesson of all, that the greatest victory is not in defeating your enemy. It is in choosing to be human even when you have every reason and every right to be something less. The ships sailed on toward Japan, toward an uncertain future. But the 47 women on board sailed with certainty in their hearts. They had survived. They had learned. And they would carry that learning forward into whatever came next, because that was the only way to honor all that had been lost, the only way to make sense of all that suffering, the only way to ensure that the blankets on that cold December night meant something more than just temporary warmth. They would remember, they would tell the truth, and they would teach the next generation that mercy is not weakness. That civilization is not about who wins. It is about what you refuse to do, even when you have the power to do it. The voyage took 14 days. 14 days of gray ocean stretching endlessly in all directions. 14 days to prepare for what awaited them. 14 days that felt both too long and far too short. The women spent the time talking. Not about the camp, not yet. Those memories were too fresh, too confusing to examine directly. Instead, they talked about what they hoped to find, what they feared they would find, who they had been, and who they might become. Emiko wrote in the notebook Sergeant Wilson had given her, page after page filling with observations, memories, questions she could not yet answer. The diary from the hospital had run out of pages weeks ago. This new notebook was a gift that kept giving holding space for thoughts that needed to be preserved. She wrote about the other women, about Ayumi practicing English phrases she had learned, her young voice stumbling over unfamiliar sounds, about Hanako reading the medical letter over and over, memorizing the techniques described, about Reiko sitting alone at the rail for hours watching the ocean, processing everything that had happened. And she wrote about herself, about the girl who had gone to Saipan believing in the righteousness of Japan's cause, about the woman who was returning with that belief shattered, about the space between those two versions of herself and what might grow there. On the 13th day, land appeared on the horizon. Japan. Home. The word still felt wrong, too small for what awaited them, too simple for the complexity of their feelings. The women gathered at the rail as the coastline grew clearer. What they saw made several of them gasp. Others turned away. Some wept openly. The coast was scarred, blackened, destroyed. Even from the water, they could see the devastation. Cities reduced to skeletal remains. ports barely functioning. The evidence of total defeat written across the landscape like a scar that would never fully heal. This is what we are returning to, Hanako said quietly. This is what our war accomplished. No one argued. No one tried to find silver linings or noble purposes. The destruction spoke for itself. The ship docked in what remained of Yokohama. The port was functioning but barely. American military personnel were everywhere, managing the occupation, coordinating aid, maintaining order. The sight of American uniforms on Japanese soil was jarring, wrong in a way that made Amiko's stomach hurt. And yet, the Americans were distributing food, setting up medical tents, helping to clear rubble, doing the work of reconstruction, just as Captain Chen had said they would. The women were processed through quickly. Their documentation was in order. They were given travel permits, a small amount of yen, and directions to transit centers where they could get help reaching their home prefectures. Then they were released into Japan, into the ruins, into whatever came next. They stood together outside the port facility, 47 women who had shared something that could never be fully explained to anyone who had not lived it. They exchanged information, addresses that might not exist anymore, names of relatives who might be dead, promises to stay in touch that they all knew might be impossible to keep. But they tried. They held on to each other a moment longer. Then they began to disperse, each heading toward their own unknown future. Amiko's journey to Tokyo took 3 days. The trains were running but unreliably. She traveled through a landscape of devastation that made her chest hurt. Entire towns were gone. Forests were burned. The countryside that had once been beautiful was marked everywhere by war. She shared a train car with other returning civilians. No one talked much. What was there to say? They all saw the same destruction. All faced the same uncertain homecoming. When she finally reached Tokyo, she almost did not recognize it. The city she had left was gone. In its place was a wasteland, block after block of nothing. Foundations, rubble, the occasional wall standing alone like a gravestone. She made her way to where her neighborhood had been, picking through streets that barely existed anymore. Everything looked the same because everything was destroyed. She got lost twice in a place she had known all her life. Then she found it, or what remained of it. The corner where her house had stood was identifiable only by the position of a well that had somehow survived. The house itself was gone, but near the well someone had built a makeshift shelter from scrap wood and metal. Her father sat outside it, staring at nothing. He looked decades older than when she had left. His hair had gone white, his face was gaunt, his eyes were hollow. "Father," she called. He looked up slowly, blinked, stared at her like she might be a ghost. "Emiko." His voice cracked. "You are alive." She ran to him then, fell to her knees in front of him. "Alive. I am alive. I am home." He touched her face with shaking hands, as if confirming she was real. Then his expression changed. He was seeing her clearly now, seeing her healthy face, her good clothes, her body that showed no signs of starvation. "You were captured," he said. It was not a question. "Yes, I was a prisoner of war, in an American camp." Something crossed his face. Shame, perhaps, or confusion, or the complicated grief of a father glad his daughter survived but devastated by how she survived. "They took care of you," he said slowly. "The Americans, they fed you." Emiko nodded, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. Her father looked away, looked at the ruins surrounding them. "Your mother died in the firebombing. Your aunt, your cousins, all gone. We starved here, ate anything we could find, watched people die in the streets, and you were being fed by the enemy." It was not an accusation. It was just truth. Painful, complicated truth. "I know," Emiko whispered. "I know, and I will carry that guilt forever. But I survived, Father. I survived to come home, to help rebuild. Is that not worth something?" He looked back at her. Tears were running down his weathered face. "Of course it is worth something. You are my daughter. You are alive. That is everything." They held each other then. Father and daughter, survivors of different hells, connected by blood and love and the shared weight of what they had lived through. That night, sitting in the makeshift shelter, eating thin soup made from American ration supplies, Emiko tried to explain. Tried to tell her father about the camp, about the kindness, about the rules and the blankets and the lessons she had learned. He listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a long time. Everything they told us was lies, he finally said. About the war, about the Americans, about what we were fighting for. I believed it all, and it cost us everything. He looked at her with something like wonder. But you learned the truth. You saw it firsthand. That is valuable, Emiko. That is something that can help us rebuild better, if we have the courage to accept it. Over the following months, Emiko found work with the occupation forces as a translator. Her English was basic but improving. Her understanding of both cultures was valuable. She helped facilitate communication between Americans and Japanese civilians, helped distribute aid, helped with the slow grinding work of reconstruction. She never hid where she had been, never lied about her treatment. When people asked, she told them the truth, that the Americans had followed rules, that they had been kind even when they did not have to be, that mercy was possible even between enemies. Some people did not want to hear it. Some accused her of collaboration, of being a traitor, of betraying Japanese honor. But others listened. Others began to understand that maybe the old ways of thinking had led them to destruction, that maybe there was something to learn from the people who had defeated them. And Emiko kept writing. Every night in the notebook Sergeant Wilson had given her, she wrote about the war, about the camp, about the people she had met and the lessons she had learned. She wrote knowing that someday, when enough time had passed, someone would need to read these words, would need to understand what had really happened, would need to learn from the truth rather than the propaganda. She wrote for her future daughter, for her future grandchildren, for anyone who might wonder what it meant to survive not just war, but the collapse of everything you believed. Hanako's return was different. She made her way to Tokyo with single-minded determination. She had to find her daughter. Nothing else mattered until she knew. She searched for 3 days, through ruins, through refugee camps, through lists of survivors posted at aid stations. Her daughter's name was not on any list. Hanako refused to accept what that might mean. On the 4th day at a shelter run by Buddhist monks, she found her. A small girl with hollow eyes and visible ribs, 7 years old but looking younger from malnutrition. She was sitting alone in a corner, staring at nothing. Yuki, Hanako called. The girl looked up, blinked, then her face transformed. Mama, Mama. She ran. Hanako caught her. They collapsed together on the floor, both sobbing, holding each other like they would never let go. Yuki talked for hours when she started, about how grandmother had died in the first firebombing, about how she had survived hiding in an air raid shelter with strangers, about how she had eaten grass and bugs and trash to stay alive, about how she had thought everyone was gone, that she was alone forever. Hanako held her daughter and felt her heart break and mend and break again. This child had suffered while Hanako was being fed, had starved while Hanako grew strong. The guilt was crushing, but Yuki did not care where her mother had been, did not care about the complicated politics of survival and honor. She only cared that her mother was alive, was here, was holding her. Over the following years, Hanako rebuilt her life around her daughter. She found work as a nurse in a hospital that was being reconstructed with American aid. She used the techniques she had learned from the American physical therapist, used the information in the letter he had given her. She never spoke much about her time as a prisoner. It was too complicated to explain, too likely to be misunderstood, but she carried the lessons with her, treated her patients with the same care and dignity that the Americans had shown her, followed protocols even when it would be easier not to, believed that rules mattered even in chaos. When Yuki was old enough to understand, Hanako told her the truth about the camp, about the kindness, about the choice between hate and humanity. Your grandmother died in an American bombing, Hanako said. That is true. But Americans also saved your mother's life by following their rules about prisoners. Both things are true, and we must be wise enough to hold both truths without letting hate consume us. Yuki grew up with that lesson. She became a teacher, taught her students about the war without propaganda, taught them that enemies could choose mercy, that civilization was about restraint, that the future was built not by perpetuating hate, but by learning from it. And when Hanako was 87 years old, lying in a hospital bed surrounded by children and grandchildren, she gave her final interview to a historian who was documenting survivor stories. "What was the most important lesson of your life?" the historian asked. Hanako thought for a long moment, then spoke with the clarity of someone who had spent decades understanding a truth. "Civilization is not about who wins the war," she said. "It is about what you refuse to do, even when you have the power to do it. The Americans had power over us. They could have done anything, but they chose to follow rules. They chose mercy. That is what makes a great nation. Not weapons, not victory, but choosing humanity even when no one would blame you for choosing cruelty." She died 3 days later. Her funeral was attended by hundreds. Patients she had treated, students her daughter had taught, grandchildren who carried her lesson forward. And on her gravestone, her children inscribed the words she had lived by. "Rules matter, mercy matters, humanity matters most." Ayumi's path was the most complicated. She was the youngest, the most adaptable, the one who had changed most during captivity. She returned to Tokyo and found nothing. Her uncle, the harsh military man who had raised her, was dead. The house was destroyed. She had no one. So she did what young people do. She adapted. She learned English fluently, found work with the occupation forces, made friends with American soldiers who reminded her of the ones who had been kind to her on Saipan. People whispered about her, called her a collaborator, questioned her loyalty. But Ayumi had learned something in that camp. That loyalty to truth mattered more than loyalty to lies. That honor was not about dying for a failed cause. That sometimes survival itself was the brave choice. In 1952, she made a decision that scandalized her remaining relatives. She emigrated to America, married an American veteran who had served in the Pacific, a man who had also learned that enemies could become friends. Her life in America was not easy. She faced discrimination, was called terrible names, was never quite accepted in either culture. Too American for the Japanese, too Japanese for the Americans. But she built a life anyway. Had children who were half Japanese and half American. Embodied the bridge between two worlds that had tried to destroy each other. She never forgot the camp. Never forgot the chocolate and the blankets and the harmonica music. Never forgot that in her darkest hour when she expected death, she had received kindness instead. In her 60s, she wrote a memoir. The title was simple, "The Blankets That Changed My Life." It told the story of 47 women who expected monsters and met human beings instead, of propaganda that crumbled in the face of mercy, of lessons learned in captivity that became the foundation for rebuilding two nations. The book was controversial. Some praised it, others condemned it, but it was honest, and in its honesty, it helped it heal wounds that had festered for decades. Ayumi lived to be 83. At her funeral, her American children and her Japanese relatives sat together. Two families, two cultures, united by one woman who had learned that the enemy of your enemy could become your family. Reiko's story was the quietest, but perhaps the most profound. She returned to find her entire family gone, her parents dead in the Tokyo firebombing, her brother executed for speaking truth, her home destroyed. Everything she had believed in revealed as lies. She could have broken, many people did, but Reiko made a different choice. She chose to transform her grief into purpose. She became a teacher. Elementary school, teaching children who had grown up in war and destruction. Children who needed to learn how to build a better future. She taught them history without propaganda, taught them mathematics and science and literature. But mostly she taught them how to think, how to question, how to refuse to accept lies just because authority spoke them. She never married, considered her students her children, gave everything to making sure the next generation would not repeat the mistakes of hers. She kept one possession from the camp, the flannel shirt from that storm night, washed carefully, folded precisely, kept in a box in her tiny apartment. Sometimes on difficult days she would take it out, hold it. Remember that night when her certainties had finally crumbled, when she had been forced to accept that her brother had died for nothing, that everything she had believed was false. And remember that from that devastation, something new had grown. Understanding, truth, a determination to be better than the lies that had consumed her generation. When she died at 72, her students organized the funeral. Hundreds came. Former students now middle-aged with children of their own, all of them carrying forward the lessons she had taught. In her will, she left the flannel shirt to a museum with a note. This shirt was given to me by my enemy on the coldest night of my life. It taught me that warmth can come from unexpected places, that mercy exists even in war, and that the people we are taught to hate are often more human than those who teach us to hate. I kept it to remember. Now I leave it so others can remember too. The shirt is on display now in a museum in Tokyo, part of an exhibit about reconciliation and healing after war. Thousands of people see it every year. Many are moved to tears by the simple cloth and the complicated story it represents. Sergeant Wilson returned to Georgia after the war. He tried to resume his old life, tried to forget, tried to move on, but he could not. The women haunted him. Not in a bad way, in a way that demanded he be better than who he had been. He went to college on the GI Bill, became a teacher like his brother had wanted to be, taught history, taught his students that war was not glory, that victory was not the point, that how you treated people, even enemies, defined who you were. He never married, threw himself into teaching instead, into making sure that young people understood the cost of war and the value of mercy. In 1968, he received a letter from Ayumi. She had tracked him down after years of searching. She was living in California now, had children, had built a life, and she wanted to thank him. Thank him for what he had almost done but chose not to. Thank him for following rules when hate would have been easier. Thank him for being part of the reason she could believe in humanity. They corresponded for 20 years after that. Letters crossing the Pacific, sharing their lives. Two people on opposite sides of a war building a friendship that helped both of them heal. When Wilson died at 83, Ayumi and her children attended his funeral. She stood at his grave and thanked him one last time for choosing to be better than his grief, for teaching her that enemies could become friends. Captain Margaret Chen continued her military career, rose to colonel, became one of the highest-ranking female officers in the Army Medical Corps. She spent her career advocating for proper treatment of prisoners, for following international law, for maintaining humanity even in the chaos of war. She never forgot the 47 women, never forgot that her choice to treat them with dignity despite her own hatred of Japan had been the right choice, the hard choice, but the right one. In her retirement, she wrote a manual on medical treatment of prisoners of war. It became required reading at military medical schools. It emphasized that prisoners were patients, first, enemies second. That care should be given based on need, not politics. She died at 91. Her obituary mentioned her many accomplishments, but the line that mattered most to her was at the end. She believed that how we treat our enemies defines us more than how we treat our friends. The years passed, the women aged, their stories became history, became lessons, became part of the foundation on which reconciliation was built. They died one by one, each carrying to their grave the memory of that October night when they expected death and received mercy instead. Each passing on to the next generation the lesson they had learned at such cost, that enemies can choose mercy, that rules matter even in chaos, that civilization is measured not by victory, but by restraint. By the time the last of them died, the world had changed. Japan and America were allies. Former enemies were friends. The hatred that had seemed so permanent had been transformed into partnership, not because anyone forgot what had happened, but because enough people chose to learn from it, chose to be better, chose mercy over vengeance. In 2005, a museum opened in Tokyo, dedicated to reconciliation and peace education. One entire wing focused on the prisoner of war experience, on both sides. Japanese prisoners in Allied camps, Allied prisoners in Japanese camps. The stories were different. Some camps had been places of horror, of brutality and death and cruelty that should never be forgotten or excused. But some camps had been different, had been places where rules were followed, where mercy was chosen, where humanity persisted even in war. The exhibit about the 47 women was one of the most visited. It featured Emiko's diary, Hanako's medical letter, Ayumi's memoir, Reiko's blanket shirt, Wilson's correspondence, Chen's manual, and at the center a simple display, A wool blanket, an empty cup for tea, a bar of chocolate in faded wrapper, with text explaining what had happened on that December night in 1945, when a storm had brought cold and 47 women had expected to suffer and Americans had chosen to provide warmth instead. School children visit the exhibit, read the stories, try to understand what it means, how people who were supposed to hate each other found humanity instead. Teachers use it to talk about propaganda and truth, about following rules even when it is hard, about choosing mercy even when vengeance seems justified. And sometimes, very rarely, an elderly person will stand in front of the display for a long time. Someone who remembers, someone who was there or knew someone who was there. And they will cry quietly, not from sadness, from something more complicated. Grief for what was lost, gratitude for what was gained, hope that the lesson will not be forgotten. Because that is what the 47 women taught. That is what their story preserves. The knowledge that even in the worst of times, people can choose to be better than their hatred. That blankets can be more powerful than weapons. That mercy can be more lasting than victory. That how we treat our enemies, when we have all the power, defines our civilization more than anything else we do. This is not a story about who won the war. It is a story about what we choose to do with power once we have it, about rules that transcend politics, about humanity that persists even when everything tries to crush it. It is a story about 47 women who walked into enemy captivity expecting death and discovered something that would sustain them for the rest of their lives. Hope, truth, and the certain knowledge that mercy is possible, even from enemies, especially from enemies, because that is when mercy matters most.